Hi, this is Bill, and this is PROTO-PROG. In our recent episodes in this channel, we've been reviewing our list of 25 proto-prog albums released in the late 1960s that helped to influence and provide the foundation for the genre of music that has since become known as progressive rock. In our first episode in this sequence, we identified the full list of 25 albums and went over the criteria that we used to select them. If you haven't seen that episode or would like to go back and review that again, you can do that. It's available here on YouTube on this link. We've also prepared individual episodes on the various albums in the list, drilling down on them from both a content and a cultural perspective. Those are all available on YouTube as well. Please feel free to go back and check those out. We think you'll enjoy what you find. This episode covers the last album in our list, and it's a terrific one. The album that is generally referred to as the beginning of the jazz fusion genre. Released in 1969, the album is Miles Davis's classic, In a Silent Way. In a Silent Way was a pivotal album for Miles Davis. When he made the album in early 1969, he was experiencing something of a crossroads in his career. Miles had been recording since the late 1940s for various labels and had made some very important and indeed classic albums over the course, with not one but two classic bands known as his first and second classic quintets. The first classic quintet, which operated in the 1950s, included great musicians like John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, and Cannonball Adderley. The second great quartet, which operated in the early and mid-60s, included keyboard player Herbie Hancock, drummer Tony Williams, and the great saxophonist Wayne Shorter. But by early 1969, Miles's fortunes were beginning to fade. He was not selling the numbers of records that he once did. His record sales had probably gone down at least by half as the age of rock and roll went forward in the middle 1960s. He was also dealing with various physical ailments. He had a serious issue with his hip, which required surgery, which the initial surgery did not go well for him. And he was also suffering from alcoholism. And he was beginning to wonder what his next steps might be in order to keep himself relevant in the music community and in the African-American community in particular, where jazz was being abandoned by younger listeners in favor of rock and roll. A catalyst in Miles's thinking here was a woman who in the late 1960s was briefly his wife, Betty Mabry. Betty Mabry, who later would become known as a musician in her own right, using the name Betty Davis, although this was after her divorce from Miles, was very well connected in the music business. She was a model, a sometime actress. Some people might call her a groupie, but she was in touch with numerous prominent musicians of the day, including two that had significant draw to Black American teenagers, Sly Stone and Jimi Hendrix. Through his relationship with Betty, Miles became acquainted with both musicians and tried to get an understanding of how he could adapt his music to make it more interesting to younger listeners. In a Silent Way was a result of Miles's experimentation in this area. He had begun putting his foot in the water with his two previous albums in 1968, Miles in the Sky and Phyllis to Kilimanjaro. It's a photograph of Betty Mabry on the second of those. On those albums, Miles began experimenting with use of the electric bass guitar and with the electric piano. On In a Silent Way, he went all in. He continued to utilize his band of that era, which included the great keyboard player Chick Corea, Jack DeJohnette on drums, and Wayne Shorter, who remained from his second classic quintet, was working with Miles as well. Miles, however, expanded this band on In a Silent Way with not one additional, but two additional keyboard players. He brought Herbie Hancock back to the fold and added an acquaintance from Cannonball Adderley's band, Joe Zawinul, who was in particular very interested in both the Fender Rhodes keyboard and was beginning also to experiment with electronic organs and with synthesizers. Miles also, for In a Silent Way, brought back Tony Williams to perform with him. And in a critical move, Miles added an electric guitarist for the first time, the great British guitarist John McLaughlin. McLaughlin was no stranger to jazz. He had played with blues and jazz bands in England going back to the early 1960s, including with Graham Bond in quartets that featured, among others, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker in their younger years, and had also made various jazz recordings along the way. Upon coming to the United States to work with not Miles, but with Tony Williams initially, to play in Tony Williams's group Lifetime, prior to signing on with Tony, McLaughlin had in fact recorded a jazz album with Jack Bruce, which interestingly would not be released for about another year, the album Things We Like. This band took a very unique approach in the studio. All the music for In a Silent Way was recorded in a single day. More interesting still was they didn't record songs so much as what might be regarded as electric mood music, background music of a sort, where one piece of music was cross-faded into the next with multiple instruments layered atop of each other over the course of the sessions. Sometimes all three keyboard players, Zawinul, Hancock, and Corea, were playing at once. It made for a very interesting melange of music, not unlike some of the approaches that would be used in the progressive rock circles in the next few years by producers like Eddie Offord and Frank Zappa. Jazz critics accused Miles of selling out to popular music. Miles didn't particularly care what the critics thought. He went ahead with this experiment, and it proved to be a successful one. In a Silent Way got Miles Davis back on the Billboard charts for the first time in about 5 years. And more importantly, it got him notoriety with the younger listening public who were willing to come out and see him in the larger venues that were at this time beginning to become more and more associated with rock and roll events. All of a sudden, with Miles now producing this album, jazz was becoming relevant again, and Miles was able to use it to extend to larger audiences and for higher profitability from an economic perspective. In a Silent Way would be the first of several albums that Miles would make in the jazz fusion vein. His next fusion album, 1970's Bitches Brew, was even more successful, reaching number 35 on the Billboard charts and attaining gold status. His 1971 album, which followed it, Tribute to Jack Johnson, is considered a masterpiece and one of the great performances in particular of John McLaughlin's career. In a Silent Way is a pivotal jazz fusion album. It is a cornerstone, basically the root of the tree, for many acts that would come after, including Chick Corea's band Return to Forever, Joe Zawinul's and Wayne Shorter's band Weather Report, which featured, among others, the great electric bassist Jaco Pastorius, and John McLaughlin's band, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, which featured, among others, the great keyboard player Jan Hammer and the drummer Billy Cobham. All of these bands did significantly well at the marketplace, and in many ways they had Miles Davis and his experimentation to thank for it. All of these bands would become very influential in the world of progressive rock as well. Prog rock musicians listened to these albums intently for ideas. One notable example of this was given by Phil Collins in interviews following the making of Genesis's 1973 album, Selling England by the Pound, where he confirmed that the very complex instrumental passages in the lead-off track from that album, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, were a direct result of listening to the Mahavishnu Orchestra's second album, Birds of Fire, made in early 1973, after McLaughlin separated from Miles Davis to start his own band. The guitar player Jeff Beck, who had always dabbled in experimental music, embraced fusion music in a very large way, ultimately bringing his career to a high point in the middle 70s with his fusion albums Blow by Blow and Wired. This music mattered in a very big way, and again, Miles Davis was at the core of it. That's all for this episode. In a Silent Way is the last of the 25 albums on the Proto-PROG list, but this is not our last episode of the series. We're going to conclude in our next episode with a discussion of records that I'll call honorable mentions, for want of a better title. We'll talk in that episode about various albums that could have been listed if not for some of the restrictions in our criteria, and we'll also specifically talk about several albums that you, our listeners, have identified in the course of reviewing our previous episodes. There are at least about a half a dozen albums that you've identified that deserve some discussion, and we will cover those in our last episode in a few days' time. Thank you all for listening as always. If you've enjoyed the episode and enjoyed the series, please click like on the episode. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel, and we will hope to see you again next time around. You take good care. Bye-bye.